The morning Evangeline Carrington arrived at Worthington Steel's corporate offices on Pemberton Street, it was raining. Not the soft, forgiving kind of rain that poets write about, the cold, indifferent kind, the kind that soaks through wool coats and ruins leather shoes, and reminds you, without sentiment, that the world does not care about your circumstances. She had one good pair of gloves. She wore them both. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, if you didn't know what it meant. 6 stories of grey stone, iron-framed windows, and a front door wide enough for 2 men to walk through side by side without touching. The name above the entrance was carved directly into the stone, not painted, not gilded. Worthington, as if it had always been there, as if it intended to stay. Evangeline stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than she should have. Behind her, the city moved the way Whitcomb Vale always moved. Fast, purposeful, and entirely uninterested in anyone who wasn't already inside the rooms that mattered. Coal carts rattled over cobblestones. A newsboy shouted something about the Railroad Commission. 2 men in silk hats crossed the street without looking up. She breathed in, then she walked through the door. The secretary at the front desk looked at her the way people in this city looked at women who arrived alone, without escort, without a calling card left in advance, with a particular kind of patient condescension that was almost polite. "Miss Carrington," the man said before she had spoken her name, so they were expecting her. That was not a comfort. She was shown upstairs, not by the secretary who handed her off to another man who handed her off to a third, through corridors that smelled of cedar and pipe smoke and the specific stillness of rooms where serious decisions are made. The carpet underfoot was dark green. The walls held no paintings, only maps, rail lines, steel tonnage projections. The American continent divided into territories of influence, color-coded and carefully measured. She did not let herself look impressed. The door at the end of the corridor was closed. The third man knocked once, opened it, and stepped aside without a word. Clarence Worthington was standing at the window when she entered. He did not turn around immediately. That was, she would later understand, entirely deliberate. The kind of small exercise of dominance so habitual, it had ceased to be conscious. He was looking down at the street below, hands clasped behind his back, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the rain against the glass and the distant percussion of the city beyond it. Then he turned. He was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. The papers called him the Steel King. The men in Whitcomb Vale's financial circles spoke his name with the particular deference reserved for forces of nature, not admired so much as acknowledged, the way one acknowledges weather. He had built Worthington Steel from a single blast furnace in western Pennsylvania into the largest privately held industrial operation in the northeastern United States. He had outlasted 3 recessions, 2 congressional investigations, and one very public attempt by a Philadelphia banking syndicate to absorb his company from beneath him, and he had done all of it without, as far as anyone could tell, losing a single night of sleep. In person, he was simply a man in a dark suit who looked at her like she was a ledger entry he was considering approving. "Miss Carrington," he said. "Sit down." She sat. He did not. The terms had been communicated to her 2 weeks prior through his attorney, a man named Aldous Finch, who spoke in the monotone of someone who had long since stopped feeling anything about the contents of the documents he delivered. She had read the proposal 3 times at the kitchen table of her family's reduced townhouse on Greer Street, while her mother sat across from her, with her hands folded and her face arranged into an expression of careful, necessary calm. Her father had been dead for 11 months. The Carrington family's debts, accumulated quietly over years through bad investments, a failed venture in railroad bonds, and a final speculative catastrophe that had stripped the estate down to the furniture, had become impossible to ignore. The creditors had been patient. They were no longer patient. The proposal from Worthington Steel was simple. Marriage, 1 year, minimum. Public, legitimate, legally binding. In exchange, settlement of all outstanding Carrington debts, restoration of the family name's credit standing, and a monthly sum directed to her mother's care for the duration of the arrangement. There was a clause on the 4th page. She had read it 5 times. In the event that the marriage produces no issue and is dissolved by mutual agreement after the minimum term, Miss Carrington shall retain no claim to Worthington assets, properties, or business interests. However, in the event of Mr. Worthington's incapacitation, death, or voluntary dissolution of the arrangement prior to the minimum term, the Carrington deed to the Allegheny tract currently held in trust and presumed forfeit, shall revert in full to the Carrington estate, the Allegheny tract, 32,000 acres of Pennsylvania land that her grandfather had purchased in 1847, that her father had used as collateral, and that had been quietly absorbed into a holding company whose majority shareholder was, she had since confirmed, Worthington Steel. He had bought her family's land, and now he wanted to marry her. She had not yet decided which part of that disturbed her more. "I have reviewed your attorney's proposal," she said. Worthington moved to his desk and sat. He did not offer her coffee or water, or any of the social lubricants that usually preceded difficult conversations. He opened a folder, her family's financial history, reduced to columns and figures, and looked at it briefly before closing it again. "And," he said, "I have a question about the Allegheny clause." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. She doubted he was easily surprised. More like recalibration. A slight adjustment. The way a man adjusts his grip on something he thought he already had. "Ask it," he said. "Why structure it that way?" she said. "If the land was already legally absorbed into the holding company, there is no reason to include a reversion clause unless the original acquisition itself was—" She paused, chose her word carefully. "Irregular." The room was very quiet. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You read the full document. I read it several times." "Most people do not." "I am aware," she said. "That is generally how arrangements like this are designed to work." He leaned back slightly. Not uncomfortable. He did not seem capable of discomfort exactly, but something in the quality of his stillness changed. He was thinking. She could see it the way you see water moving beneath ice, not on the surface, but present. "The clause is standard," he said finally. "It is not," she said. "I had it reviewed by an independent attorney." Another silence, longer this time. Outside the window, the rain had not stopped. "Miss Carrington," he said, and his voice carried the specific weight of a man who chose every word the way other men chose investments, for maximum return, minimum exposure. "I did not require a wife who understands contract law." "No," she agreed, "but you acquired one." She signed the papers that same afternoon, not because she had no choice. That was the story she would tell herself later, and it was partly true, but only partly. She signed because the Allegheny clause meant something real. It meant the land could come back. It meant her grandfather's 32,000 acres, the thing her father had lost, the thing that had quietly unraveled everything, was not gone forever. It was suspended, waiting, held inside a legal structure that could, under the right circumstances, release it back to where it belonged. And it meant that Clarence Worthington, for all his stone buildings and carved name and color-coded continental maps, needed something from her too. She did not know what yet, but she intended to find out. The attorney Finch collected the signed documents without ceremony. Worthington stood at the window again, already returned to it, as if the meeting had concluded the moment she made her decision, and he had moved on to the next item on his agenda. He did not shake her hand. He did not offer any formal word of acknowledgement. As she reached the door, she heard him speak. "The wedding will be in 6 weeks," he said. "You will be given a household account. Mrs. Hartwell manages the domestic staff. She will contact you regarding the residence on Ashford Square." She paused at the door, did not turn fully, just enough. "Mr. Worthington." He did not turn from the window. "I want it understood," she said, quietly and without heat, "that I know what I signed. All of it. Every clause. Every page." He was still for a moment. The rain pressed against the glass. "So do I," he said. She walked out. The door closed behind her with a sound that was perfectly ordinary, a latch-catching wood meeting frame, and yet it seemed to her, standing in that cedar and pipe smoke corridor, with her one good pair of gloves, still damp from the morning rain, that something had already shifted, that some arrangement older and more serious than a legal contract had just been made between two people who did not yet understand each other at all. She pulled on her gloves. She walked to the stairs, and somewhere behind that closed door, she was quite certain, Clarence Worthington was still standing at the window, looking down at the city that belonged to him, thinking about the one thing in it that for the first time in a very long while he could not entirely predict. The wedding was set, the contract was signed, and Evangeline Carrington walked out of Worthington Steel's offices on Pemberton Street with nothing but her name, her gloves, and the quiet, absolute certainty that the man she was about to marry had made, without realizing it, the most consequential mistake of his career. The house was beautiful in the way that certain things are beautiful when no one lives in them, Tall ceilings, dark wood paneling polished to a mirror finish, curtains of deep burgundy that caught the morning light and held it without warmth. Every surface in the residence on Ashford Square had been chosen by someone with impeccable taste and no particular interest in comfort, which was, Evangeline would come to understand, a precise architectural reflection of the man who owned it. She arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days before the wedding, to meet the staff and review the household arrangements. Mrs. Hartwell, the head of domestic operations, was a compact woman somewhere past 50, with iron-grey hair and the particular efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing large households for men who did not want to be bothered with the details. She showed Evangeline through each room with practiced precision: the parlor, the dining room, the library, the morning room, reciting capacities and schedules and staff assignments with the calm fluency of a telegraph operator reading dispatches. "Mr. Worthington takes breakfast at 7 o'clock sharp," Mrs. Hartwell said as they passed through the dining room. "He does not take it in the dining room. He takes it in his study with the morning papers. He does not require company at breakfast." "I see," said Evangeline. "Dinner is at 8. He's generally home by 7:30, though some evenings he sends word. On those evenings dinner is held for 1 hour and then served regardless." "Served to whom?" Mrs. Hartwell looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, but was very precise. "To whoever is present, Miss Carrington." Evangeline looked around the dining room. The table seated 16. The chandelier above it held 42 candles, and was never, she suspected, lit to full capacity. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell," she said. "I think I understand the house." What she understood was this: the house on Ashford Square had been designed for appearances and managed for efficiency, and somewhere inside it, Clarence Worthington moved through his evenings like a man passing through a train station, present, purposeful, and already thinking about the next departure. She was going to live here. She straightened her spine and followed Mrs. Hartwell to the next room. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning in late October. It was not a large affair, which surprised some people and surprised no one who actually knew Clarence Worthington. There was no cathedral, no reception dinner for 300 guests, no announcement in the social pages beyond a single, factual line confirming that the marriage had occurred. The ceremony was held in the parlor of a judge who owed Worthington a professional courtesy, witnessed by Aldous Finch on one side and Evangeline's mother on the other, and concluded in under 30 minutes. Her mother cried quietly throughout. Evangeline held her hand before the ceremony began and released it when her name was called. Worthington did not look at her during the vows with any particular softness. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in his office, directly, assessingly, without pretense. When the judge pronounced them married, he gave a single nod, as if confirming a transaction he had already decided to approve. He did not kiss her. That detail, she would discover, was noted by both witnesses in different ways, her mother with a small, carefully suppressed flinch, and Finch with absolutely no reaction whatsoever, which told her this had perhaps been discussed in advance. They rode back to Ashford Square in the same carriage, sitting across from each other, and said nothing for the first 4 blocks. Then Worthington said, without looking up from the document he had opened on his knee, "There is a reception next Friday at the Alderman's. We are expected to attend together. Mrs. Hartwell will arrange what you need." "All right," she said. 2 more blocks of silence. "Is there anything you require for the household?" he asked, still not looking up. "Not at present. If there is, speak to Mrs. Hartwell first. If it exceeds the household account, bring it to Finch." "And if it requires speaking to you directly?" she asked. He looked up then, brief, measuring. "Then speak to me directly," he said, and returned to his document. She looked out the carriage window at Whitcomb Vale passing by, the storefronts and the gas lamps beginning to flicker on in the grey afternoon light, the pigeons on the courthouse steps, the whole ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care that she had just been married. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her with its steadiness, "This is what I agreed to. This is exactly what I agreed to." She had not agreed to anything more. The first 2 weeks inside the house on Ashford Square established a rhythm that was precise and almost entirely impersonal. Worthington left before 7 each morning. He returned between 7 and 8 each evening, sometimes later, once or twice past 10 without explanation. He worked through dinner more often than not. She would see the light under his study door when she passed in the hallway, hear the low scratch of pen on paper or the occasional shift of his chair, and that was the extent of his presence in the house most evenings. When they did dine together, the conversation was functional. He would ask about the household, whether anything needed attention, whether she had received any correspondence that required a joint response. she answered directly. She did not attempt to fill silences with pleasantries. She had decided early that this was the correct approach, not out of resignation, but out of strategy. A man like Worthington would not respect performance. If she was going to understand what he actually needed from this arrangement, she needed to watch him, not entertain him. So she watched. She noticed that he read 2 newspapers each morning and 3 financial circulars each evening. She noticed that he signed correspondence with his left hand and held his coffee cup with his right. She noticed that he never, in the 2 weeks she had observed him, spoke of his business at dinner, which was itself a kind of information, because men who were confident in their empires generally talked about them, and men who were managing something difficult generally did not. She noticed that he had a habit, when thinking, of going very still. Not the stillness of inattention, the opposite, the stillness of a man whose mind was moving very fast. She filed all of it away. The reception at the Alderman's was the first time Whitcomb Vale society saw them together. The house on Meridian Street was full by the time they arrived. 200 guests at minimum, the gaslight warm and golden, the kind of room where fortunes and reputations circulated like currency. Evangeline had worn a dress of deep blue, simply cut, with no jewelry except her grandmother's pearl earrings. She had made this choice deliberately. She was not performing wealth she did not currently possess. Worthington, for his part, was received the way he was always received in these rooms, with a kind of careful, deferential gravity, men straightening slightly as he passed, conversations pausing and then resuming at a different register. He did not work the room. He simply existed in it, and the room reorganized itself accordingly. What Evangeline had not anticipated was how he handled her presence beside him. He introduced her without fanfare and without any of the performative warmth that some men deploy with new wives in public. No hand at the small of the back, no conspiratorial smile, no theater. He simply said her name and let it stand on its own. My wife, Evangeline. And then he listened to whoever they were speaking to, and occasionally looked at her when something was said that he judged might interest her, which was, she noticed, more often than she had expected. At one point, near the far end of the room, a man named Hargrove, a railroad investor with sharp eyes and the reputation of someone who tested the edges of rooms for weaknesses, made a comment about the Carrington family's recent difficulties. He directed it at Worthington, but positioned it so that Evangeline could hear it clearly. It was the kind of comment that was not quite an insult, but was designed to produce one in response. Worthington looked at the man for a moment. "The Carrington estate," he said, with the evenness of someone stating a geographic fact, "is under Worthington management now. I would recommend updating your information, Hargrove. Inaccurate assessments are expensive habits." The man smiled and changed the subject. Worthington did not look at her afterward. He turned to the next conversation without pause, without any gesture that suggested he had done something on her behalf. But he had. She knew it. And somewhere in the careful architecture of the evening, something small shifted. Not warmth, not yet, and not trust, but the first faint outline of something she had not included in her calculations when she signed the contract on Pemberton Street. The recognition that the man beside her was not entirely what he appeared to be either. They rode home in the usual silence. The city was quieter at this hour, the gas lamps haloed in the autumn cold, the streets emptying toward midnight. Evangeline looked out the window and thought about Hargrove's expression when Worthington had corrected him, about the specific word he had used. Management. Not acquisition. Not absorbed. Management. As if the Carrington name was still something he considered worth protecting. She did not know what to do with that. When they arrived at Ashford Square and the carriage door was opened, Worthington stepped out first, which was simply his habit, she had observed, a practicality rather than a discourtesy. And then he turned and offered his hand to help her down. She took it. It lasted approximately 3 seconds. The contact was brief and correct, and entirely unremarkable. But as they walked through the front door and into the house that was learning, slowly and reluctantly, to feel like something they both inhabited, rather than somewhere they each happened to be, she noticed that he did not immediately release her hand when she had stepped down. He held it for 1 second longer than necessary. Then he let go and walked toward his study, and the light appeared beneath the door, and the scratch of the pen resumed, and the house settled into its nighttime quiet. Evangeline stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she walked to the library, sat down by the window with the cold city pressing against the glass outside, and opened the copy of the Allegheny land deed she had been quietly reconstructing from public records for the past 11 days, because whatever Clarence Worthington was or was not, whatever last night's carriage ride had or had not meant, the land was still the reason she was here. And she had just found, buried in the deed's margin notation in her late father's handwriting, a discrepancy that changed everything she thought she knew about how Worthington Steel had acquired it. The house on Ashford Square was beginning to feel like something more than an arrangement, but beneath the floorboards of that careful, quiet life, something much older was starting to surface, and when it did, neither of them would be able to pretend the contract was all there was. The notation was small. 4 lines of her father's handwriting in the lower margin of the 3rd page of the original Allegheny deed, the copy she had been reconstructing piece by piece from public land records at the Whitcomb Vale County Clerk's office, requesting documents in separate visits, so that no single clerk would notice the pattern of her interest. The handwriting was cramped and slightly uneven, the way her father's handwriting always became when he was writing quickly and under pressure, and it read, "Transfer conditional. Consent of second heir required per grandfather's codicil. EMC signature binding. See trust document filed separately, Clerk's Office, Allegheny County, November 1871. EMC, Evangeline Margaret Carrington." She sat in the library with the reconstruction spread across the reading table and the city dark and silent beyond the window, and read those 4 lines 11 times. Then she set the paper down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Her grandfather had filed a codicil, a secondary condition, attached to the land trust that required her signature, specifically hers, not her father's, not her mother's, for any transfer of the Allegheny tract to be legally binding, which meant that when her father had used the land as collateral, when the holding company had absorbed it, when Worthington Steel had acquired the holding company, and with it 32,000 acres of Pennsylvania land that had been in her family for over 4 decades, none of it had been valid, not without her signature, not without a signature that, as far as she could determine, had never been obtained, because no one, not her father, not Finch, not Worthington, had ever mentioned a codicil, had ever asked her to sign anything related to the land transfer, had ever, in any conversation she could recall, acknowledged that her grandfather had attached a secondary condition to the deed at all. Either they did not know, or they had known, and proceeded anyway. She sat in that library chair until the fire burned down to coals, and the clock on the mantel struck 2 in the morning, turning both possibilities over in her mind with the steady, methodical attention of someone who understood that the difference between those 2 explanations was the difference between a mistake and a crime. She said nothing the next morning, or the morning after that. She had learned in the weeks since arriving at the house on Ashford Square that information held quietly was information that retained its power. The moment you revealed what you knew, you surrendered the advantage of knowing it alone. And she was not yet ready to surrender anything. Instead, she watched Worthington more carefully than before. She watched the way he reviewed correspondence at dinner, the slight tension in his jaw when something displeased him, the particular stillness that preceded a decision. She watched the way he spoke to Finch when the attorney came to the house on Wednesday evenings for their regular review, not the content which she was not present for, but the cadence she could hear through the study door as she passed in the hallway. Measured, controlled, occasionally sharp. The voice of a man managing something that required constant attention. She began to wonder what, specifically, required that much attention. On the Thursday of the 3rd week, she went to the Allegheny County Clerk's office herself. She told Worthington she was visiting her mother, which was not entirely untrue. She did visit her mother briefly on the way back. She took the train alone, which caused Mrs. Hartwell a visible degree of professional distress that Evangeline addressed with calm authority, and a request that it not be mentioned. The codicil was there, filed exactly where her father's notation had indicated, in November of 1871, 2 years before his death, and 9 years before the land transfer that had preceded the collapse of the Carrington estate. It was a single page, witnessed and notarized in her grandfather's formal legal hand, and it was precisely what the margin notation had described. The Allegheny tract could not be transferred, sold, mortgaged, or otherwise alienated from the Carrington estate without the written consent of the eldest Carrington granddaughter, to be obtained at or after her majority. There was a second page. She had not expected a second page. The second page was a letter, filed with the codicil, addressed in her grandfather's handwriting to no one by name, simply, "To whoever holds this document when the time comes." It was 3 paragraphs long. The first described the land itself, the geography, the timber, the river access that made the western portion of the tract uniquely valuable. The second described his reasons for the codicil. He had not trusted that the land would be protected through the male line of the family, a concern he expressed with the blunt pragmatism of a man who had watched his son's financial instincts with growing unease for years. The third paragraph said, "The land is not simply land. There is iron ore beneath the western ridge, assessed privately in the autumn of 1868, documented in the survey attached to this letter in the county records. The quantity is significant. I did not disclose this publicly because I did not trust what men would do with the information. I trust my granddaughter to know when and how to use it." She stood at the clerk's counter for a long moment. Iron ore, beneath the western ridge of the Allegheny tract. Worthington Steel's entire operation ran on iron ore supply. It was the single most critical variable in his production capacity. She knew this because she had spent 3 weeks reading every financial circular and industry report she could locate. And the question of ore supply came up in every analysis of the company's long-term position. His current supplier contracts were reliable, but not permanent. The industry understood that whoever controlled the next significant ore deposit in the northeastern corridor would control the next decade of American steel production. Her grandfather had known about the deposit for over 20 years and told no one. And now she was the only person alive who knew both things at once, that the land transfer was legally invalid, and that beneath the land in question was the resource that could determine the future of Worthington Steel. She folded the copies she had requested, placed them inside her coat, thanked the clerk with the composure of someone conducting entirely routine business, and walked out into the grey Pennsylvania afternoon. She did not tell him that evening. She sat across from him at dinner, the long table with its 2 place settings at one end, the candles lit, the quiet efficiency of the household moving around them, and she ate and answered his brief questions about her day and listened to him describe in the clipped, abbreviated way he communicated everything, a complication with a rail freight contract out of Pittsburgh, and she thought about iron ore and codicils and the specific expression on his face 2 weeks ago when he had told Hargrove that the Carrington estate was under Worthington management. She thought about the word management again. Had he known? Had he known the transfer was conditional and proceeded regardless, betting that no one would find the codicil, that she would never look, never think to look, that she would sign the marriage contract and accept the terms and spend the minimum year in this house and walk away with her family's debt settled and nothing more? Or had he genuinely not known? She looked at him across the table. He was reading something, a brief that Finch had left, she assumed, from the look of the document, with the focused quiet of a man entirely inside his own thinking. She said, "May I ask you something about the company?" He looked up. The question was outside the usual register of their dinners. She saw him note this. "Go ahead," he said. "Your ore supply contracts," she said carefully, keeping her voice in the same tone she used to discuss household matters, neutral, practical, conversational. "Are they structured long-term or reviewed annually?" A pause. Brief, but present. "Annually," he said. "Why?" "I was reading an industry circular," she said. "There was a commentary on northeastern supply chain vulnerability. I was curious whether it was relevant to your position." He looked at her for a moment longer than the question required. "It is relevant to everyone in the industry," he said slowly. "Why are you reading industry circulars?" "I live in a steel magnate's house," she said. It seemed useful to understand what that means. Something crossed his expression, not quite amusement, not quite suspicion, but some combination of the two that she had not seen on him before. He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his, and neither of them said anything, and the candles burned steadily between them. Then he returned to his brief. "The circulars in the library are current through last quarter," he said, without looking up. "If you want the full supply chain analysis, it is in the blue folder on the second shelf. Finch put it together in August." She said, "Thank you." He said nothing, but she noticed, she was careful to notice everything now, that he did not read again for almost a full minute after she had spoken. He simply held the brief in his hands and looked at the far wall with the particular stillness of a man whose mind was moving fast beneath a very controlled surface. 3 days later, Finch came to the house on a Thursday evening as usual. She was in the library when she heard him arrive. She heard the study door close. She heard, after approximately 40 minutes, Worthington's voice rise briefly, not loudly but with an edge she had not heard from him before. sharp and controlled, the voice of a man confronting something he did not like. Then silence. Then the low murmur of the conversation resuming. Finch left after an hour. Worthington did not come to dinner. Mrs. Hartwell delivered a tray to the study without comment, with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had seen variations of this evening before, and Evangeline sat alone at the long table and ate in silence, and thought about what could have sharpened Clarence Worthington's voice behind a closed door. She thought she might already know, and later that night, passing the study on her way upstairs, she stopped. The light was still on beneath the door. The house was otherwise entirely quiet. She raised her hand to knock, then did not. She stood in the hallway with her hand near the door and the silence of the house pressing around her, and she thought about iron ore and invalid transfers and her grandfather's letter and the 1 second in a carriage on a cold October night when a man who did not do unnecessary things had held her hand a moment longer than necessary. She lowered her hand. She went upstairs. But she left the copy of the codicil on the library table, not the full document, just the first page without the letter, without any mention of the ore, slightly visible beneath the edge of a book she had left open there. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to be found. She had not decided yet whether she was protecting him or preparing to dismantle everything he thought he owned. The truth was, in the cold quiet of that November house, she was no longer entirely sure those two things were different. He found the page on a Friday morning. She knew, because she heard him stop in the hallway outside the library at 6:30, before his usual departure, before the household had fully woken, and the footsteps that had been moving with their customary purpose simply ceased. For almost 2 full minutes, there was no sound from that direction at all. Then the study door opened and closed. He did not leave for the office at 7. He did not leave at all. By 9 o'clock, Evangeline was in the library with her tea when Worthington appeared in the doorway. He was holding the page. He had clearly been holding it for some time. The paper was slightly creased at the corner where his thumb had pressed it, the way you press something when you are thinking very hard and your hands have nowhere useful to go. He set it on the table between them without speaking. She looked at it, then at him. "Where did you get this?" he said. It was not quite a question. "The Allegheny County Clerk's office," she said. "It was filed there in November of 1871. It has been there the entire time." The silence that followed was the longest silence she had experienced in that house, which was a house already fluent in silence. He did not sit. He stood at the edge of the table with the grey morning light coming through the window behind him, and looked at the page, and then at her, and then at some middle distance that held neither of them. "Did Finch know?" he said. It was the first question she had not fully prepared for, not because it was unexpected, but because of what it revealed about the question he was not asking first. He was not asking whether the transfer was valid. He was not asking what she intended to do. He was asking about Finch, which meant he was asking about himself, which meant some part of him already suspected the answer. "I don't know," she said, which was the truth. "But I think someone did." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He placed both hands flat on the table. He looked at the page. "The transfer was processed through 3 separate holding companies over 14 months, he said, quietly, more to himself than to her. "Finch structured it. I reviewed the final acquisition and approved it. I did not review the chain." "You trusted the chain," she said. "Yes, that was the point," she said. "If it was deliberate, if someone knew about the codicil and structured the chain specifically to obscure it, then the acquisition was designed to be approved without examination. You were not supposed to look closely enough to find a problem." He was very still. "There is something else," she said. She reached into the book beside her and placed the second document on the table, the letter, her grandfather's 3 paragraphs, and the survey notation at the bottom, and the words, "significant quantity," sitting in plain ink in the middle of the page. He read it once, then read it again. When he looked up, something had changed in his face, not collapsed, not broken, but altered, the way a room looks different when you move the light source. Same room, different shadows. "Iron ore," he said. "Beneath the western ridge," she said. "Assessed privately in 1868, never disclosed. The survey documentation is still on file in Allegheny County, attached to the codicil record." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the city was going about its Friday morning. The coal carts, the newsboys, the whole indifferent machinery of Whitcomb Vale, and inside the library on Ashford Square, the steel king of the northeastern United States sat across from his wife of 6 weeks and understood, with the full and unsparing intelligence that had built his empire, exactly what she was telling him. The land was not validly his. The transfer required her signature and had never received it. Beneath the land was a resource that could determine the next decade of American steel production, and the woman sitting across from him had known all of this, had found it herself piece by piece in county clerk offices while telling his housekeeper she was visiting her mother, and had left one page where he would find it, rather than delivering it to an attorney. "Why did you not take this to a lawyer?" he said. She considered the question honestly. "Because I did not know yet," she said, "whether you had done this deliberately or whether it was done to you." "And now? Now I think it was done to you," she said, "and I think you need to know that before either of us decides what comes next." What came next took 3 weeks. Finch, when confronted with the codicil documentation and the structural analysis of the acquisition chain, did not deny it. He had known. He had restructured the transfer specifically to route around the codicil's requirements, betting, correctly as it had turned out until now, that the secondary condition was obscure enough and the Carrington family distressed enough that no one would look. He had not informed Worthington because Worthington, he had assessed, would not have approved the acquisition under those conditions. He had been right about that too. Worthington dissolved the professional relationship within 48 hours. The legal unwinding of the Allegheny acquisition took longer. 4 months, 2 separate attorneys, and a negotiation that Evangeline sat in on at Worthington's direct request, because she had found the codicil and understood the documents better than anyone else in the room, and he was not, it turned out, a man who let pride interfere with competence. She signed the Allegheny tract back into Carrington ownership on a Wednesday afternoon in early March. 32,000 acres. Her grandfather's land. Her signature, finally, where it had always been required. The ore deposit was a separate negotiation entirely. She proposed the terms herself, in a meeting that was just the two of them, in the library where all the serious things in that house seemed to happen. Worthington Steel would hold exclusive mining rights to the Western Ridge for a period of 20 years, in exchange for a revenue share structured to fund a Carrington family trust, the first beneficiary of which would be her mother, and the remainder of which would be managed at Evangeline's discretion. He reviewed the terms for a long moment. "You drafted this yourself," he said. "Yes, it is a fair structure," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her across the library table, the same table where he had set down the creased page on a grey Friday morning and begun, without knowing it, the process of losing the one thing in his professional life he had never planned to lose. The absolute certainty that he controlled every variable in his world. Evangeline, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without a formal prefix. In 6 months of marriage and cold dinners and carriage rides and Whitcomb Vale receptions, he had called her Miss Carrington out of habit, long after it was accurate, or Mrs. Worthington in public, or nothing at all when nothing needed to be said. She waited. "I would like to continue the arrangement," he said. "Not the contract. The contract is satisfied. I mean..." He paused, selected his words with the care she had watched him apply to everything that mattered. "I would like to continue." She looked at him for a long moment. This was not the man who had stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back while she waited to be acknowledged. This was not the man who had told her what time breakfast was served and that he did not require company. This was a man sitting in his own library at the end of a long unwinding, asking for something he did not know how to ask for, in the only language he had ever been fluent in. Direct, unornamented, stripped of pretense. "The ore rights agreement," she said finally, "is a 20-year contract." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "it is." She picked up the pen, signed her name on the final line, set it down. "Then we have 20 years to see what this is," she said. She rose from the table, walked to the window and looked out at Whitcomb Vale in the pale March light, the city that had watched the Carrington name diminish and the Worthington name rise, that had calculated their marriage as a transaction and their union as an acquisition. The city did not know about the codicil. It did not know about the iron ore. It did not know that the Steel King's empire now ran through a deed that bore his wife's signature, freely given, legally binding, and entirely on her terms. It did not know, and it would not know for some time, that the most consequential negotiation in Worthington Steel's history had taken place not in a boardroom on Pemberton Street, but in a library on Ashford Square, between two people sitting across a table, learning, slowly, imperfectly, and without any particular sentimentality, that the only contract neither of them had read closely enough was the one they had made with each other. The land was hers. The rights were structured, the terms were signed, and Clarence Worthington, the Steel King of Whitcomb Vale, sat in the library of his own house and understood with complete and final clarity that he had never owned the most valuable thing in it.